In October 1943, the sky over central Germany was already crowded with contrails when the American bomber formation crossed the Rhine and turned east toward Schweinfurt. And at that exact moment, the men inside the B-17 flying fortresses understood that this would not be like the missions before, because the air was clear, the sun was high, and there was nowhere to hide. And the long silver stream of aircraft from the 8th Air Force stretched for miles, tight combat boxes stacked one above the other, every plane holding position by yards and seconds, knowing that spacing meant survival and separation meant death. And this moment had been building since dawn when crews were briefed in England and learned that the target was once again the ball bearing factories that fed the German war machine, a target already soaked in memory and loss, a place where formations had been torn apart before. And now the lead elements of the 1st Bombardment Division were flying straight into the heart of the Reich, with no long-range fighter escort waiting to save them once fuel limits were reached. Because in October 1943, American doctrine still believed that tightly flown formations of heavily armed bombers could protect themselves, that disciplined geometry and overlapping fields of fire could repel anything the Luftwaffe threw at them. And that belief was about to be tested minute by minute, as German radar stations had already tracked the bombers from the coast, ground controllers had already scrambled fighter groups, and airfields across Bavaria and Franconia were already launching Bf-109s and Fw-190s. While inside the bombers, oxygen masks hissed, engines droned at steady power, and the temperature dropped far below freezing, forcing crews to rely on electrically heated suits that often failed without warning. And as the formation pressed on, flak bursts began to appear, black puffs rising slowly and then violently shaking aircraft as steel fragments tore through wings and fuselages, not aiming to destroy every bomber, but to disrupt the formation, because German gunners understood that breaking the boxes apart was the first step to killing them. And yet the formation held. Because each pilot had been trained to fly through fear and concussion, to keep his eyes locked on the tail and wingtip of the aircraft ahead, to trust instruments when vision blurred, and to maintain position even when the bomber next to him took a hit and began trailing smoke. Because drifting out of place would open a hole, and holes invited fighters, and fighters meant loss. And already the first German interceptors were climbing through the flak, approaching from head-on where the bomber's defensive fire was weakest, and the closing speed was greatest. And as they came in, they fired cannons and rockets designed to shatter cockpits and break wings. And in those seconds, the American gunners could only track the shapes rushing toward them and squeeze triggers, hoping that the massed fire would be enough. And sometimes it was, as fighters broke away trailing smoke or vanished in flashes. But often it was not, and bombers began to fall behind, damaged, wounded, engines failing. And the doctrine demanded that the formation not slow for them, because slowing meant inviting disaster for everyone. And so the main body pressed on while stragglers were left exposed, a reality understood by every crew long before they ever crossed the channel. And still, the formation refused to break, because even as losses mounted, the structure remained intact. BOTS leaders held headings, squadron leaders relayed corrections, and the bomb run timing was calculated down to seconds, so that hundreds of aircraft could drop thousands of bombs without colliding. And beneath them, the German countryside slid by, peaceful in appearance, deceptive in reality, while above them the sky became a battlefield of converging forces. And as the formation neared Schweinfurt, the intensity increased, because German commanders knew this target mattered. Ball bearings were essential to tanks, aircraft, and vehicles, and the defense was layered and ruthless. Heavy flak batteries ringed the city. Fighters were vectored precisely, and the bombers were forced to fly straight and level for long minutes during the bomb run, unable to maneuver without ruining the attack. And in that window, the Luftwaffe pressed hardest, attacking again and again, sometimes in coordinated waves, sometimes individually, always seeking to fracture the American geometry. And inside one B-17 after another, systems failed, oxygen lines were severed, radios went silent, control cables stiffened or snapped, and wounded men struggled to remain at their stations, not as cinematic heroes, but as trained crewmen performing tasks drilled into them over months, because panic served no purpose at 20,000 feet. And as bombs were released, the aircraft leapt upward, suddenly lighter, and for a brief moment there was relief as the mission objective was fulfilled. But relief was fleeting because the formation still had to turn for home, still had to run the gauntlet again without fighter cover, still had to cross hundreds of miles of hostile airspace, and the Germans were not finished because they understood that the return leg was often when formations weakened, when damage accumulated, when fatigue set in, and so they stayed with the bombers, harrying them relentlessly, forcing crews to fire until ammunition ran low and guns froze or jammed. And yet despite everything, the main formation continued to fly as a unit, absorbing punishment that would have shattered less disciplined groups. And that refusal to break was not born of bravado, but of necessity, because breaking apart meant annihilation, and every man knew it. And so as the bombers finally reached the limit of German fighter range and began to see the distant promise of Allied escort aircraft, the formation was thinner, scarred, and trailing wreckage. But it was still a formation, still organized, still moving west as one body. And as the channel came into view hours later, the survivors understood that this single mission had cost the 8th Air Force dearly, that dozens of aircraft were missing and hundreds of airmen were gone, and that the belief in unescorted daylight bombing had been shaken but not yet abandoned, and the formation that refused to break had done so at terrible cost. And as the surviving bombers began their descent toward English fields, damaged and low on fuel, the final tally was still unknown, the consequences still unfolding, and the question of whether such formations could endure again hung unanswered in the cold autumn air. And even as the surviving aircraft settled into landing patterns over eastern England, the strain of what had just occurred did not release its grip, because ground crews counting returning bombers already knew how many parking spaces would remain empty. Intelligence officers were already marking missing squadrons on wall maps, and commanders were already calculating loss percentages that pushed the edge of what the 8th Air Force could sustain. And yet, within hours, the surviving crews were being debriefed, questioned carefully about fighter tactics, flak concentrations, timing, and formation behavior, because this mission was not only a strike against Schweinfurt, but a test of doctrine, and the answers mattered. And as men described head-on attacks in tight passes, cannon fire tearing through noses and cockpits, coordinated assaults that pressed formations from multiple angles, it became clear that the Luftwaffe had adapted, that German fighter control was precise, disciplined, and relentless, and that the bombers' defensive fire, while formidable, had not been decisive enough to prevent catastrophic losses when escorts could not stay with them. And this realization spread quietly through briefing rooms and headquarters without speeches or dramatics, because there was no need for exaggeration. The numbers spoke clearly enough. And at High Wycombe, where 8th Air Force Command Staff studied reports late into the night, the conclusion formed that what had just happened over Germany could not be dismissed as an anomaly, because it followed a pattern already seen in earlier deep penetration raids, and now that pattern was undeniable. And yet, despite this growing awareness, there was no immediate alternative, because long-range escort fighters capable of accompanying bombers to distant targets in the Reich were still limited in number and range, and production schedules could not be accelerated by will alone. And so the pressure remained on bomber crews to keep flying, to keep formations tight, and to keep proving that discipline and numbers could still carry the day, even as the cost rose. And this pressure filtered down through every level of the force, from generals to group commanders, to squadron leaders, to individual crews, who understood that survival depended not on individual skill alone, but on the collective behavior of hundreds of aircraft moving as one. And so training intensified, Formation flying was drilled relentlessly, and gunners were taught to conserve ammunition and prioritize targets, because the next mission would likely be no easier, and perhaps worse. And as October wore on, the weather closed in, limiting operations and providing a brief pause that allowed both sides to absorb lessons learned. And on the German side, those lessons were equally clear, because despite heavy losses to flak and defensive fire, the Luftwaffe had inflicted damage that mattered, had forced the Americans to confront the vulnerability of daylight bombing without escort. And German commanders believed that continued pressure could slow or even break the offensive before it reached decisive strength. And so, tactics were refined further, rocket attacks were emphasized, head-on passes were perfected, and units were rotated to maintain effectiveness, while flak defenses around key industrial targets were reinforced, creating zones where bombers would be forced to fly through overlapping fire for extended periods. And by November, the air war over Europe had become a contest, not just of machines, but of endurance, logistics, and industrial output. Because every bomber lost represented not only 10 men, but months of production and training. And every fighter lost strained German resources already stretched thin. And in this environment, the American leadership faced a dilemma that had no easy answer, because halting deep strikes would concede initiative and allow German industry time to recover, while continuing them risked unsustainable losses. And this dilemma was not resolved quickly or cleanly, because war rarely offered such clarity, and instead, missions continued with adjustments at the margins. Timing changed, routes varied, altitudes shifted, but the core challenge remained. And bomber formations were still being asked to fly long distances into defended airspace with limited escort, relying on the same principle that had just been tested so brutally over Schweinfurt. And as crews climbed into aircraft again and again, they carried with them the memory of missing friends and empty bunks. Not as melodrama, but as fact, because every group had felt the losses. And yet, the formations continued to assemble. Engines starting in sequence, aircraft taxiing in long lines, lifting into gray skies and forming up over England before turning east once more. And in the air, the same discipline was demanded, because nothing had changed about the fundamental geometry of survival. And as new missions unfolded, the formations sometimes held and sometimes bent under pressure, sometimes absorbing attacks and sometimes losing cohesion despite best efforts. And each engagement fed back into planning and training, creating a cycle of adaptation that would eventually transform the air war, but not yet, because the transformation required time, and time was measured in lives and machines. And so the escalation continued, not in a single dramatic moment, but in accumulated strain, mission after mission, decision after decision, each one narrowing the margin for error. And by late 1943, it was clear to those watching closely that the American daylight bombing campaign stood at a critical juncture, balanced between persistence and collapse, between belief and evidence. And the formations that refused to break were being asked to prove, again and again, that refusal alone could be enough, even as the sky over Europe grew more hostile and the cost of holding together rose toward a point where something would have to change. And that point was approaching faster than anyone yet admitted. And as that point approached, the pressure intensified in ways that were not always visible from headquarters maps or loss tables, because inside the formations, the margin between cohesion and collapse narrowed with every mile flown. And by the early months of 1944, the 8th Air Force was operating at a tempo that pushed crews, aircraft, and doctrine to their limits, as targets shifted deeper and deeper into Germany, and the Luftwaffe concentrated its remaining strength against the bomber streams, knowing that stopping them outright was no longer realistic, but breaking their effectiveness still might be. And on mission after mission, the same pattern emerged. Long assembly over England, careful timing, formations locking together with mechanical precision, then the slow crossing of the channel and the sudden transition into contested airspace where flak began to rise and radios filled with clipped reports of damage, stragglers, and wounded men. And it was in these moments, hours into flight, cold and exhausted, that the danger of near failure became most acute, because discipline depended on clarity, and clarity eroded under constant stress. And when lead aircraft took damage or navigational errors crept in, entire boxes could drift, forcing rapid corrections that rippled backward through hundreds of planes, increasing collision risk and opening gaps that German fighters were quick to exploit. And the Luftwaffe, though diminished, was still capable of delivering concentrated blows at precisely those moments of instability, sending groups of fighters in coordinated head-on passes followed by attacks from the rear and below, exploiting blind spots and forcing gunners to split attention. And sometimes this pressure achieved what flak alone could not, because aircraft that had survived earlier phases suddenly found themselves isolated, slipping out of formation as control surfaces stiffened or engines faltered. And once isolated, their survival time shortened dramatically, a fact understood by every crew watching a lone bomber fall behind, its fate sealed not by drama but by arithmetic, because one aircraft could not generate the defensive fire of a box. And yet, even as these losses mounted, the core formations continued forward, driven by orders and by a shared understanding that turning back without cause was not an option. And this refusal was tested most severely during long penetrations, when escort fighters still could not remain for the entire route, leaving bombers alone for critical stretches. And in those windows, the Luftwaffe pressed hardest, not seeking individual victories, but cumulative damage, because they knew that forcing bombers to abort, jettison bombs, or scatter reduced the effectiveness of the entire raid. And so the air battles became less about spectacular destruction and more about attrition and disruption, measured in delayed bomb runs, missed targets, and degraded formations. And American commanders watched these trends with growing concern, because while bomb damage assessments sometimes showed results, the cost per mission remained high, and replacement crews were arriving faster than they could be seasoned, creating formations where experience was unevenly distributed, increasing the risk that under stress, mistakes would cascade. And those cascades were the greatest threat of all, because a single navigational error or formation break could compromise an entire wing. And this reality loomed large during several critical missions where weather compounded enemy action, forcing formations to fly through cloud layers that obscured visual references and made station keeping more difficult. And when bombers emerged back into clear air, they were sometimes misaligned, boxes overlapping or drifting apart, creating exactly the confusion German fighters were waiting for. And in those moments, American gunners fired until barrels overheated and ammunition belts ran low, while pilots wrestled damaged aircraft back into position using muscle memory and instinct honed by repetition. And sometimes it worked, the formation tightening again under fire, and sometimes it did not, and aircraft were lost not in isolation, but in clusters as fighters exploited temporary breakdowns in order. And these were the moments when the entire concept of self-defending bomber formations seemed on the verge of failure, because if cohesion could not be maintained under combined pressure from fighters, flak, weather, and fatigue, then the premise that bombers could fight their way to targets unaided collapsed with it. And this realization was not theoretical, but immediate and operational, because commanders could see it in after-action reports and debriefings, in the consistent pattern of losses peaking during escort gaps and periods of formation disruption. And by midwinter 1944, the situation reached its most dangerous point, as the Americans prepared for operations that would be essential to upcoming ground campaigns, requiring sustained pressure on German industry and transportation. And failure in the air would have consequences far beyond the loss of aircraft. And yet the means to solve the problem were still incomplete, because while new escort fighters were arriving in greater numbers, integration was uneven. Tactics were still evolving, and coordination between bombers and escorts was not yet seamless. And until it was, the bomber formations remained vulnerable during critical phases of flight. And this vulnerability was exposed starkly on missions where German resistance surged unexpectedly, forcing formations to adapt in real time without clear guidance, relying on the judgment of individual group and squadron leaders to maintain alignment and timing under fire. And those decisions were made not with perfect information, but with partial reports, damaged radios, and fleeting visual cues. And a single misjudgment could lead to aircraft crossing paths, bombs dropped off target, or entire groups forced to abort. And as these near failures accumulated, they created a sense within the force that the margin for error had all but disappeared, that the formations were holding together by discipline alone, while the strategic environment shifted beneath them. And it was at this point, with losses mounting and effectiveness under scrutiny, that the American air offensive stood at a true turning point, because either the formations would soon be given the protection and tactical support needed to restore confidence and cohesion, or the continued strain would force a fundamental change in how the air war was fought. And that outcome was not yet decided, as the bombers climbed once more into hostile skies, formations assembling with practiced precision, engines droning steadily, carrying with them a doctrine pushed to its breaking point and a campaign balanced on the edge between persistence and collapse. And that edge was finally crossed as the balance between exposure and protection shifted decisively in the months that followed, because the same industrial and organizational momentum that had built the bomber force now delivered the missing element that doctrine alone could not supply: long-range escort fighters in sufficient numbers, coordinated under evolving tactics that recognized the limits of rigid bomber self-defense and replaced assumption with evidence. And as P-51 Mustangs and extended-range P-47s began accompanying formations deep into Germany, staying with them not just to the border but to the targets and beyond, the character of these missions changed in ways that were immediately apparent to those inside the bombers. Not as a sudden absence of danger, but as a redistribution of pressure, because German fighters that once massed against the bomber boxes were now intercepted earlier, forced to fight for airspace rather than exploit bomber geometry. And while flak remained lethal and losses did not disappear, the formations gained breathing room at precisely the moments where near failure had once loomed. And this change did not occur in isolation, but alongside refinements in formation leadership, communications, and route planning that reduced the likelihood of cascading errors. Because escort presence allowed bombers greater flexibility to maneuver defensively without fear of immediate isolation. And this flexibility translated directly into cohesion, as damaged aircraft were more often able to remain within protective envelopes rather than slipping fatally behind. And over time, the data reflected this shift as loss rates declined and mission completion rates improved, reinforcing confidence not through rhetoric but through repeated experience. And German responses, though adaptive, increasingly face structural limits because fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and constant pressure from escorts eroded the Luftwaffe's ability to concentrate force at will, forcing it into reactive postures that reduced its effectiveness against massed bomber streams. And this erosion was cumulative, not dramatic, measured in fewer intercepts reaching effective range, in attacks disrupted before coordination could be achieved, and in defensive fighters forced to disengage early to avoid destruction. And inside the bombers, the change was felt as a subtle but profound difference in rhythm, because while missions remained long, cold, and exhausting, the sense that a single formation error would inevitably lead to catastrophe diminished, replaced by a recognition that the air battle had become layered, contested across depth rather than focused solely on the bombers themselves. And this allowed American commanders to plan with greater confidence, committing forces to sustained operations that supported broader strategic goals, including preparation for the invasion of Western Europe, where air superiority would be decisive. And the formations that once refused to break because they had no alternative now refused to break because they no longer stood alone, supported by a system that acknowledged earlier limits and corrected them through adaptation rather than abandonment. And this evolution did not erase the sacrifices that had preceded it, because the cost paid in 1943 and early 1944 remained embedded in the structure of the force, shaping training, caution, and respect for discipline. And those lessons carried forward into every subsequent mission, reinforcing the understanding that cohesion was not an abstract ideal, but a practical requirement forged under pressure. And as the air campaign progressed, the effectiveness of American daylight bombing increased steadily. Not because formations became invulnerable, but because they became resilient within a combined arms framework that integrated bombers, fighters, intelligence, and logistics into a coherent whole. And this coherence translated directly into impact on the ground, as transportation networks were disrupted, industrial output strained, and German responses increasingly fragmented. And by the time the Allied armies moved ashore in Normandy, the air environment above them reflected this transformation, with American air power operating at a scale and consistency that would have been impossible during the period when bomber formations flew alone into the Reich. And the moment that had once defined the edge of failure became, in retrospect, a pivot rather than an endpoint, because the formation that refused to break did more than survive a single mission. It exposed the limits of an idea under real conditions and forced an institution to adapt. And that adaptation reshaped the air war over Europe in measurable ways. Visible not in dramatic single events, but in the sustained ability to project power day after day, mission after mission, until resistance weakened and outcomes became irreversible. And when historians later traced the arc of the American strategic bombing campaign, they identified this transition not as a triumph of courage alone, but as a convergence of experience, evidence, and change, where refusal to break evolved into the capacity to endure with support. And the skies that had once threatened collapse instead became an arena where control was steadily asserted, not absolutely, not without cost, but decisively enough to alter the course of the war as it unfolded in real time.